pleasure for me to introduce Sarah Snyder, who I have gotten to know last year or so. She's been here in Washington, D.C. for that time. Prior to that, she was at University College London, where she taught, but she is now at American University's School of International Service. She is also a member, or was a member, maybe she just rotated off of the board of Schaefer.
As of December 31st.
December 31st, okay, very, very soon. She is the author of Dictators, Diplomats, and Dissidents, U.S. Human Rights Policy in the Long 1960s, and has also published articles on the Cold War, human rights activism, and U.S. human rights policy in a variety of journals, Diplomatic History, Cold War History, Human Rights Quarterly, and so on. So it's a real pleasure for us to have her here today to speak about human rights before the Carter administration.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to speak from up here so that I can see people more clearly. I want to thank the Washington History Center, the National History Center, and the Woodrow Wilson Center for inviting me to speak here today. As Dane mentioned, over the last sort of 15 months since I moved to Washington, I've attended these seminars quite regularly and have found them to be very stimulating and an important community for me to be a part of. So I'm very pleased to be presenting. And also setting this date on the schedule and having it looming ahead of me for the entire semester has really forced me to clarify my thinking about the book project that I'm working on. In the aftermath of the 1967 coup in Greece, American academics mobilized to save one of their own. They feared the execution of Andreas Papandreou, a rising political leader in Greece who had taught economics at the University of Minnesota and Berkeley. When 250 economists wrote to the White House asking the United States to act on Papandreou's behalf, Lyndon Johnson reportedly said, "This is the first issue in history on which all the American economists seem to have agreed." Later that evening, Johnson reportedly advised his aide to call upon the economist John Kenneth Galbraith, who had been leading this campaign on behalf of Papandreou, and tell him, quote, "I've told those Greek bastards to lay off that son of a bitch," whoever he is. So White House aides were cognizant of the extent to which Papandreou's incarceration focused attention on U.S. policy toward Greece. One wrote, "Our major problem here in the White House is domestic concern for the safety of Andreas Papandreou. Andreas's friends have mounted a major telephone campaign, which some of us fear could cause real trouble." The problem was that in the wake of the coup, and here there's a photo of U.S.-made army tanks on the street in Athens during the coup. In the wake of the coup, the Greek junta dealt harshly with its perceived enemies, arresting them, subjecting them to torture, and imprisoning them in island concentration camps. But Greece's membership in NATO and Cold War security concerns meant that many governments were hesitant to criticize the regime too harshly. The Johnson administration condemned the nature of the regime, repeatedly inquired about the fate of political prisoners such as Papandreou, and here there's a photo of Andreas with his family after his release from prison later that year. The U.S. also implemented an embargo against heavy military exports, but importantly, it did not actively undermine the new leaders. There was an ongoing debate over administration policy, given concerns that stemming the flow of military aid to Greece could weaken NATO. In addition, the Johnson administration became increasingly focused on access to Greek bases after the outbreak of war in the Middle East in June of 1967, which heightened the strategic significance of the Mediterranean. As a result, in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, the United States lessened its criticism of the military junta, and the Johnson administration opposed and defeated Senate efforts to end military assistance to Greece. Debates concerning U.S. policy toward Greece in the wake of the coup are characteristic of many of the trends that made human rights rise in prominence in the subsequent decade. First, the plight of an identifiable political prisoner, such as Papandreou, served as a rallying point for disparate actors in the United States. Second, a range of academics, concerned citizens, international human rights groups, and ad hoc NGOs succeeded in keeping attention on human rights violations and limiting the Johnson administration's policy options. And third, although policymakers ultimately prioritized their military alliance with Greece over concerns about the country's internal politics, to signal such precedents too openly risked angering influential members of Congress, suggesting the issue was increasingly important in political calculations. Greece is one of a number of cases I am analyzing for my second book, Dictators, Diplomats, and Dissidents, U.S. Human Rights Policy in the Long 1960s, which will examine the emergence of attention to human rights in the United States from 1961 to 1976. Now, underlying much of the existing literature on U.S. human rights policy, and by which I mean the extent to which the United States takes account of human rights as it formulates its foreign policy, is the conviction that human rights were of limited consequence in the 1960s and early 1970s. But my book will advance a new interpretation of U.S. foreign policy in these years, showing that efforts to emphasize human rights began earlier than most accounts suggest. My research has shown that changes at the international level and new trends in American domestic politics during the 1960s enhanced interest in the character of U.S. foreign policy. Specifically, I analyze how changing demographics at the United Nations, the establishment of NGOs such as Amnesty International, concerns about the direction of U.S. foreign policy in the wake of the United States intervention in the Dominican Republic, and growing disillusionment with the war in Vietnam, as well as greater congressional activism in foreign affairs, all led to increased concern for the protection of human rights. My research on the evolution of human rights as a component of U.S. foreign policy allows me to explore broader questions about the relationship between American values and ideals and the content of U.S. policy. At issue for many was the extent to which Cold War priorities were diminishing America's image abroad and undermining the morality of U.S. foreign policy, which are questions that remain critical today. I argue that in certain cases, those that were giving the United States real trouble, far more attention was paid to human rights in the formulation of U.S. foreign policy than was previously realized. Further, I show that congressional and non-governmental activism over the long 1960s laid an important foundation for Jimmy Carter and others to build upon in the years that followed. In my research, I have examined how the United States responded to human rights violations in Greece after the 1967 coup, Southern Rhodesia after the 1965 unilateral declaration of independence from Great Britain, in South Korea during various stages of authoritarian rule there, the Soviet Union, and in Chile after the 1973 coup. In addition, I've investigated the influence of the United Nations 1968 International Year for Human Rights and congressional hearings, most notably in 1973. I've identified considerable interest in and sustained pressure on human rights violations overseas, with members of Congress and interested non-state actors often pressing the executive branch to take more steps to address these abuses. I want to be clear that when I use the term human rights today, I mean the political and civil liberties that United States actors at the time sought to protect, not the fuller list of human rights that's outlined in the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, despite considerable pressure, the White House and the Department of State made minimal shifts in American policy. The interventions that U.S. officials did make largely coincided with existing U.S. foreign policy objectives. I'm going to talk about several of those instances today, focusing on key moments in addition to Johnson's intervention on behalf of Papandreou, where the United States responded to human rights violations. Then I will examine perhaps the most surprising example in these years of the United States ignoring human rights violations, those in the USSR. And finally, I will argue that U.S. policy during the long 1960s, or in the years before Carter became president, had significant degrees of continuity with that which followed. Before turning to the rest of my talk, I just want to take a brief minute to talk a bit about my methodology. The book draws upon a range of sources in the United States, Chile, the Netherlands, the UK, and Switzerland. My research utilizes the records of the Departments of State and relevant presidential libraries, the archives of non-governmental organizations such as Amnesty International, the International League for Human Rights, Freedom House, and the American Civil Liberties Union, as well as UN documents, British and Chilean foreign ministry records, the personal papers of members of Congress interested in human rights, interviews, memoirs, and secondary sources. So now to return to the substance of my talk. John F. Kennedy included the term human rights in his 1961 inaugural address, declaring that a new generation of Americans were, quote, unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed, and to which we are committed today, at home and around the world. The available documentation shows that the Kennedy administration was attentive to human rights violations overseas in only 4 places, each of which was significant to the president's broader foreign policy goals. So first, the Kennedy administration paid attention to political prisoners in Cuba. Now, given the Kennedy administration's obsession with Fidel Castro's regime, it is perhaps unsurprising that it sought to highlight human rights violations there. The Kennedy administration shined a spotlight on the high number of Cuban political prisoners and refugees in speeches at the United Nations and elsewhere. The administration also closely followed racial discrimination in Rhodesia and apartheid in South Africa. As Kennedy was eager to attract newly independent African countries to the Western side in the Cold War, his administration's focus on violations that resonated widely on the African continent fit with his policy priorities. By the middle of 1963, the United States decided that it would stop selling arms to South Africa by the end of the year, in an effort to avoid damage to its relations with Black African nations. The Kennedy administration then hoped that, at least temporarily, a unilateral suspension of arms sales to South Africa would satisfy those internationally and domestically who wanted the United States to take a tougher stance against apartheid. In addition, in an effort to highlight his administration's opposition to apartheid, Kennedy explicitly criticized South Africa twice in his address to the United Nations General Assembly several months later. By the end, Kennedy's policy was, as Philip Muhlenbeck has put it, quote, rhetorical support for the idea of African self-determination without the use of sanctions or other direct pressure against Portugal or South Africa, which might have risked jeopardizing America's ability to fight the Cold War. In the end, although Kennedy criticized apartheid, he did not break with the South African government. Finally, Kennedy exerted pressure on South Korea's military government to return to civilian rule. As historian Greg Brzezinski has written regarding U.S.-South Korean relations for the United States during the Cold War, quote, the preservation of democracy at home often meant support for anti-communist autocrats abroad, even if the costs were exorbitant. Despite congressional pressure, the United States rarely pressed its ally to improve human rights practices. One notable exception was when, in March of 1963, the South Korean leader Park Chung-hee announced the extension of military rule for 2 more years. And I won't get into this today, but the other notable exception was when U.S. diplomats believed that a prominent dissident South Korean politician Kim Dae-jung, who had been kidnapped from his hotel in Tokyo, was about to be murdered, and in that case, U.S. diplomats also intervened. More broadly, throughout the Kennedy through the Ford administrations, the United States remained largely reticent about human rights abuses there, content with a politically stable anti-communist ally, and distracted by more pressing issues such as the war in Vietnam. In the aftermath of the 1961 military coup in South Korea, the United States conveyed its deep regret. Bringing Kennedy up to speed on events in Seoul, the acting Secretary of State, Chester Bowles, wrote, quote, "The Department of State believes that it is especially important that the Republic of Korea maintain its adherence to democratic procedures and constitutional processes, which are among the Republic's chief assets in its struggle against communism." When Park announced in August of 1961 that South Korea would return to civilian rule in 2 years, U.S. officials reported, although this timetable is somewhat slower than we would have preferred, General Park's announcement does represent a step in the right direction, in that it provides a public commitment to return to representative constitutional government by a specific time. Park also released more than 5,000 political prisoners and committed to an amnesty for other prisoners. The embassy in Seoul remained concerned about the consequences of Park's political repression, which it feared could weaken the government, and the United States remained focused on moderating his rule. One of the steps that the United States took was inviting Park to the White House in November of 1961. In an effort, this step was seen as an effort to bring stability and legitimacy to his regime. Now, I want to be clear that American attention to human rights violations there were not motivated by concerns about the South Koreans who faced repression and abuse, but by how such a political climate could foster instability and leave South Korea open to communist interventions. Therefore, the United States continued to prioritize a return to civilian rule in South Korea, which meant that when, on March 16, 1963, Park declared it necessary to push off plans for a transition to a civilian government for 4 more years, the United States was galvanized to act. In a March 21st meeting with Park, the United States ambassador to South Korea advised that the United States, quote, "cannot possibly approve and might be compelled openly to oppose the continuation of military government for 4 more years." 4 days later, the State Department warned, quote, "We believe that the prolongation of military rule could constitute a threat to stable and effective government, and we understand that this whole matter is being re-examined by the Korean government." It turns out the Korean government wasn't necessarily yet ready to change, and the South Korean ambassador to the United States went to the White House to meet with Kennedy to try and explain Park's reasoning for this need to extend military rule. But the president was not persuaded. After their meeting, Kennedy wrote to Park in Seoul saying, "We believe that a solution to the current political problem in Korea is to be found through consultations between governmental and political leaders with a view to reaching an accord on a procedure for transition that will be acceptable to the Korean nation as a whole." One observer argues that Kennedy scarcely hid his contempt for Park's regime. Now, during the Kennedy years, the South Korean government was highly dependent on American aid, which was approximately $270 million annually. To demonstrate American opposition to this plan to extend military rule, U.S. officials threatened to withhold support for South Korea, leading Park to announce that the elections would go forward. An administrative history of U.S.-South Korean relations during the Kennedy years demonstrates that officials saw American actions here as effective, suggesting the utility of threats to withdraw economic aid and the influence that the United States had on South Korea. And despite South Korea's return to civilian rule, an open democratic system did not develop, and Park's increasing authoritarianism would complicate American-South Korean relations for years to come. As was the case in Greece, political repression in South Korea during Johnson's presidency raised questions about American priorities in its relations with its strategic allies. The United States had hoped to encourage greater respect for political and civil rights in South Korea, but limits on democracy there were largely overlooked, given the close security relationship between the two countries. For example, when in March 1964, widespread student demonstrations broke out against a settlement between Japan and South Korea, National Security Council staffer Robert Comer displayed an enormously callous attitude toward the security of South Korean students protesting against the government. He wrote, quote, "Korean student riots, ostensibly against ROK or Republic of Korea Japan settlement, but actually against ROK government, are getting worrisome. No one expected they'd reach such intensity. Students are normally feisty this time each year." All in all, instead of urging Park and his Rasputin, Kim Jong-pil, to be more democratic, maybe we ought to tolerate a little more dictatorship in this messy fief. Conveying his perception of the US government priorities in stark language, Comer wrote, "Korea is still a mess, so I'd settle for a bit more stability." Similarly, Nixon and Kissinger were far less troubled than Kennedy by the character of Park's government, as the Nixon administration was primarily focused on two issues in its relations with South Korea. First, keeping South Korean troops in Vietnam to facilitate the Guam or Nixon doctrine, and reducing US personnel stationed in South Korea. As Park moved toward increasing authoritarianism, the United States ambassador in Seoul, Philip Habib, urged that Washington disassociate itself from Park. But a member of the National Security Council disagreed with Habib's preference, writing to Kissinger that, quote, "While we regret the character of Park's reorganization and believe it unnecessary, his new system is not inevitably destabilizing," which demonstrates the degree to which Washington's overriding priority was stability. The United States response to the crisis over Rhodesia's unilateral declaration of independence from Great Britain in 1965, which was intended to ensure the continuation of white minority rule there, similarly demonstrates that in the long 1960s, the United States responded to human rights violations only when it was in its political or geostrategic interest to do so. In response to the leader of Southern Rhodesia, Ian Smith's Declaration of Independence, the United States withheld recognition of his government, recalled the American consul from Salisbury, shelved its United States Information Agency activity, froze loans and credits to Smith, opposed American travel to Rhodesia, and demanded those who did travel there have British visas. In addition, the United States put in place an embargo against shipments of heavy military equipment and arms. It encouraged American businesses to cease dealings with Rhodesia and suspended sugar imports from the territory. Furthermore, the United States and Great Britain supported ending the shipment of oil and petroleum products to Rhodesia. These immediate US actions were motivated by several factors: a desire to support Britain in order to maintain Allied unity, the desire to build upon the goodwill of Johnson's civil rights policy, that this policy had engendered in African leaders, an American preference to avoid confrontation with South Africa over apartheid, and American economic and strategic interests on the continent. Johnson made a political calculation that he could curry favor by opposing Smith without being forced to follow suit against South Africa, which could have far greater costs. The administration's response provoked opposition from both the right and the left, including proponents of human rights who wanted the White House to act more forcefully against the white minority regime. American continued interest in disavowing Smith's regime, despite opposition, was driven by several factors. First, the United States felt a connection to the Rhodesian situation, given its own struggle to improve the conditions of African Americans. Second, the United States' stated commitment to self-determination and anti-colonialism was important. And finally, given the concerns about Black African leaders' views of the United States, some saw a cost in Black African and African American support of the Johnson administration if it did not continue to oppose Smith. Those pressing for American activism on Rhodesia included Representative Adam Clayton Powell, a Democrat from New York, A. Philip Randolph and Donald S. Harrington, who were the co-chairs of the American Committee on Africa, James Farmer, the executive director of the Congress for Racial Equality, Martin Luther King, Roy Wilkins, the executive director of the NAACP, Amnesty International's Secretary General Sean McBride, and a number of American newspapers. The NSC urged Johnson to continue to support the British response to Smith in order to, quote, stay on the right side of all the Afro-Asians. The Deputy National Security Advisor Comer further emphasized this point in a memorandum, writing, quote, Rhodesia isn't very important to us, but the point is that it's critical to all the other Africans. They see it as a straight anti-colonial issue, and all their anti-white instincts are aroused. So our stance on this issue will greatly affect our influence throughout Africa. It will be a test of whether we mean what we say about self-determination and racialism. Comer argued to Johnson, quote, Vietnam, South Asia, or Berlin are far away. But these African issues are seen by Africans as an intimate part of their own struggle for independence from colonialism. American officials were highly cognizant of the potential positive public relations aspects of their policy. As one official wrote, the U.S. public position on Rhodesia is one about which we can crow, as we are standing on such honored principles as racial equality, human rights, and government by the consent of the governed. In a National Security Council meeting, the United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Arthur Goldberg, explained, the American position on the recent United Nations vote that had taken place limiting the importation of minerals and goods from southern Rhodesia, as well as curtailing most sales of arms, munitions, and materials to be used by the military in southern Rhodesia by saying, we are obliged to vote in the United Nations as we did, because to do otherwise would have caused us domestic racial difficulties and hurt our business interests in every African country. Yet American opposition to Smith did not precipitate stronger pressure against his regime, as this interest in what Comer termed the Rhodesian mess was limited. Despite limited White House interest, there were U.S. officials, such as Arthur Goldberg, who would have liked an even firmer approach, not only against Rhodesia, but also with respect to South Africa. And he spoke out repeatedly against the system of racial discrimination in Rhodesia, and his speeches, particularly at the United Nations, demonstrate a full commitment to racial equality among other human rights issues. His strong opposition to Smith's regime was consistent with his commitment to civil rights and his position at the United Nations, where these issues were at the forefront of all of the debates going on in these years. And he advocated a harder stance by the United States. Civil rights language influenced those committed to opposing racial discrimination in Rhodesia. Goldberg made the link between the domestic civil rights movement and opposition to Smith's regime explicit in a letter to Benjamin Bradley of the Washington Post, writing, frankly, I don't see how we can have a double standard with respect to civil rights, one at home and another abroad. Goldberg later suggested that the United States needed to be more consistent in its approach to racial discrimination, writing, the president's outstanding record of civil rights at home is not matched by our attitudes abroad. In Goldberg's view, American opposition to Smith's regime was necessary for United States policy to remain consistent with the country's values. He argued, first, the basic issue in Rhodesia is self-government for all the people, regardless of race. Our country, founded on the proposition that all men are created equal, and currently engaged in a vigorous nationwide program to make that equality real for our own Negro citizens, cannot honorably turn its back on what is happening in Rhodesia. Goldberg was not the only official to emphasize this theme. Two NSC staffers wrote to Johnson, quote, Your accomplishments in race relations and civil rights here at home make it essential that our position on similar issues abroad be consistent with domestic policy. Failure to do so, if this issue becomes widely publicized, would alienate some members of Congress, American Negroes, civil rights groups, labor, church groups, and liberals in general. Like Goldberg, Representative Donald Frazier of Minnesota wanted the United States to implement more aggressive sanctions against Rhodesia, arguing, "We should not wait until we are pushed by the African and Asian nations and then try to achieve the weakest possible compromise." Fraser suggested that the United States needed to do more than just support the British boycott of Rhodesia, asserting, "If we are the leader of the free world, we should take the initiative." He wrote, "I feel that we should work toward majority rule in Rhodesia because I think the United States has a moral commitment to equal treatment for all persons regardless of race." Despite their efforts, Goldberg, Frazier, and others were unable to convince the Johnson administration to take a tougher stance on Southern Rhodesia or South Africa. The case of Southern Rhodesia, like Greece, serves to illustrate that human rights had a place on the foreign policy agenda of the United States in the 1960s, but not a prominent one. Examining U.S. policy toward Southern Rhodesia demonstrates that many members of Congress, non-governmental actors, and lower-level officials pressured the White House to take a strong stance against Smith's discriminatory and repressive regime. Yet with each administration, the United States only engaged when doing so aligned with its interests. For Johnson, supporting Britain's stance against Smith and United Nations sanctions that targeted his government was a low-cost way to demonstrate his bona fides as an opponent of racial discrimination to Black Africans and civil rights supporters in the United States. The Nixon administration, which was less attentive to civil rights concerns, was more focused on superpower détente and sympathetic to business interests, and therefore weakened the United States' stance on Rhodesia. It was not until the Ford years, when Secretary of State Henry Kissinger feared that growing instability in Southern Africa could enable the expansion of communist influence in the region, that he began efforts to seek a diplomatic solution there. I want to turn now to the communist bloc to give an overview of the most surprising case study in my book. Given that the United States was engaged in an ideological, military, and economic conflict with the Soviet Union, we might expect to see far greater attention paid to human rights violations there. After all, Carter's human rights policy was described by a close aide as, quote, "a very pragmatic tactic to really beat up morally on the Soviets in the Cold War." Indeed, anti-communism was often justified by the repressive nature of the communist system, which limited most notably the freedoms of religion, movement, and to hold private property. Yet American efforts to improve relations with the Soviet Union through the pursuit of détente, from the Johnson through the Ford years, as well as varying levels of commitment to human rights in the White House, made these administrations less likely to press human rights concerns than might initially have been expected, given the propaganda component of Cold War competition. Just as with its Cold War ally, Greece, the White House often felt that more could be gained in its relationship with the Soviet Union by overlooking human rights violations than championing them. As such an approach was not uniformly supported within Congress and in non-governmental circles, leading to ongoing negotiation about the proper place of human rights concerns in Soviet-American relations throughout this period, with interested members of Congress and private citizens seeking to influence successive administrations to prioritize human rights violations in the Soviet-American relationship. With regard to human rights broadly in these years, United States policy was complicated by two competing objectives: highlighting Eastern European human rights violations for propaganda purposes, and pursuing détente with the Soviet Union for larger political and strategic reasons. Actually safeguarding human rights was a lower tier priority for most policymakers. we will see that the pursuit of détente was prioritized in almost every instance in these years. The United States had noted Soviet human rights violations to some degree going back to the Eisenhower administration. And it was actually Nixon, as vice president under Eisenhower, who first delivered to Soviet officials lists of individuals who the United States hoped would be able to emigrate. Yet the United States did not raise human rights with the Soviets during the Kennedy years. Arthur Goldberg, who during the Kennedy administration was Secretary of Labor and a Supreme Court Justice, along with Senators Jacob Javits and Abraham Ribicoff, pressed Kennedy in 1963 to pay more attention to Soviet abuses, particularly against Jews, but to no avail. Secretary of State Dean Rusk told the three that the administration wanted the State Department to remain uninvolved and urged that the initiative be led by Jewish groups and leaders. The Johnson administration continued Kennedy's position that direct confrontation with the Soviets should be avoided, although indirect criticism was more prevalent. But growing protests and congressional activism made U.S. officials realize that they had to engage the issue more meaningfully from a domestic politics perspective. After all, this is a period of time in which rallies in support of Soviet Jewry were drawing thousands of protesters. In December 1970, Nixon met with American Jewish leaders in the Oval Office to discuss the plight of Soviet Jewry, the first time a president had done so. Meeting with Jewish leaders was far less threatening to détente than confronting the Soviets directly, and he made no promises, and ultimately inaction largely prevailed. The most significant measure to address Soviet human rights violations was a congressional initiative, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which was an amendment to the 1974 trade bill that linked U.S. extension of most favored nation trading status to Soviet emigration practices. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment presented a considerable threat to détente and executive branch control of foreign policy. The amendment's supporters were motivated by the conviction that the issue was of little concern to the White House, and therefore felt that they had to take matters into their own hands. Under increasing pressure domestically, Ford, after an April 1976 meeting with ethnic leaders in Milwaukee, requested that the State Department raise United States concern about several prominent political prisoners. This request spurred considerable discussion within the administration, with Ford's Special Assistant for Ethnic Affairs urging more presidential involvement, whereas NSC staff such as A. Dennis Clift and Brent Scowcroft raised concerns about the negative impact such intervention might have on Soviet-American relations. Within the administration, Scowcroft argued, quote, "A policy of quiet diplomacy will best serve our national security interests, while offering the best prospect for benefiting Soviet political prisoners." In the end, a U.S. diplomat in Moscow brought American concern regarding these 5 Soviet political prisoners to the attention of a Soviet official at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Scowcroft's hesitation demonstrated that the administration had not transformed its policy. Rather, I think the impetus likely derived from 2 factors. First, Ford was in a tight race for the Republican nomination with former California Governor Ronald Reagan. And Ford's toughness with the Soviets and his support for human rights were both at issue in the campaign. Second, the value of détente was declining in the White House's view, both as relations with the Soviets became more complicated and given the policy's political liability in the United States. It turns out that U.S. human rights policy toward the Soviet Union, despite being the United States' ideological Cold War adversary, was no less complicated for U.S. policymakers than addressing the human rights violations of its allies. The United States' reluctance to criticize the Soviet human rights record exposed a rift between official policy and popular sentiment, which I would argue is one factor that led to the declining support for détente and Gerald Ford's defeat in the 1976 election. So what is the contribution that I hope to make with this project? In The Last Utopia, Sam Moyn writes, quote, "The drama of human rights, then, is that they emerge from the 1970s seemingly from nowhere." And he points particularly to 1977 as the breakthrough year for human rights. So in some ways, the contribution is about periodization. I'm trying to demonstrate, and I hope that I'm doing it successfully, the concern for human rights in U.S. foreign policy began earlier than most accounts, including mine, suggest. But the purpose of shifting this timeline backwards is to illuminate the members of Congress and interested citizens who believe that the United States had been too willing to support right-wing dictators and had become overly reliant on military solutions, and who pushed instead for a more moral foreign policy. I believe that this project shows that activism by non-governmental or lower-level actors could prod the executive branch into action on human rights. Their activism over the long 1960s pushed the issue of human rights onto the United States foreign policy agenda, such that the administration of Jimmy Carter and those that followed had to formulate a policy on human rights. So why is this all important? Well, I think that my work emphasizes that United States attention to human rights is not just due to the initiative of one man, Jimmy Carter. Persistent congressional and non-governmental attention to the issue was essential to its continued salience, because executive branch commitment to the issue fluctuated depending on who occupied the White House. Efforts to institutionalize human rights, such as State Department bureaucratic reforms and the department's annual country reports that were implemented in these years, ensured that human rights would remain an element of U.S. policy even after Carter had left the White House. More significant for broader discussions of U.S. foreign policy, I see a great deal of continuity between the attention devoted to human rights by the 4 presidential administrations that preceded Carter's and Carter's own record. Now, I recognize that my characterization does not reflect a consensus on Carter's human rights record, and I have written favorably elsewhere on the support that he and National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski gave to human rights activists inspired by the 1975 Helsinki Final Act. But considerable literature, whether by Luca Trenta on Iran, Kenton Clymer on Cambodia, Bradley Simpson on Indonesia, Simon Stevens on South Africa, and Rosemary Foote on China, has demonstrated that the Carter administration largely ignored human rights concerns when they did not coincide with larger strategic goals. Therefore, I think that my work demonstrates that episodic or inconsistent attention to human rights characterized the White House approach to human rights through the last 3 decades of the Cold War. Despite this challenge, over the course of the 1970s, broader concern for international human rights deepened. And eventually it grew into a transnational movement comprising non-governmental organizations, individuals, and key political actors that had far-reaching implications for international relations. Thank you.
And now we turn to the discussion, question and answer part, and we already have a hand up. But before you get the microphone, the ground rules are, wait for the mic. Please identify yourself before you speak. So, up here, please.
Stephen, sure, wonderful talk. 2 brief questions. The first is you have to begin the story somewhere, but I was tempted that you didn't mention the 1930s, where after Kristallnacht, Roosevelt withdrew our ambassador to Berlin. As far as I know, the only nation to do that. However, in response, there was, as far as I know, no American response to the Holodomor, the forced famine in the Ukraine, where millions died. I don't think there was any American diplomatic effort to confront Stalin at a time when it would have had no geostrategic negatives. And also, of course, there was could only mention so many countries, but our record with, say, Chiang Kai-shek, who was systemic human rights abuses in Haiti, where dissidents, the names of dissidents were turned over to Duvalier and subsequently tortured by the Tutsan Makud. Iran, after the Shah returned, where Savak was systemically, and the invasion of Cyprus, where Carter reversed the ban on military sales to the Turkish armed forces.
Great. So these are two big questions about periodization and case selection. And I will start with why not the 1930s? Well, I'm a historian of the Cold War, and the way that I came to this project is for a number of years I've been teaching a course on United States attention to international human rights, beginning with the Atlantic Charter. And there was no great book for me to use that was sort of a survey. And so I thought initially for my second book that I should write that book. You know, you should write a book if you see a gap, particularly if maybe your students would use it. But what I realized was that although there was a burgeoning interest in the 1970s and now even into the 1980s, there was very little secondary literature for me to draw upon on the period sort of from the Bricker Amendment controversy in the Eisenhower years up really until opposition to some Nixon administration policies. And I thought, if I'm going to have to do all of that primary research myself, that should be the focus of my work. So that's a bit of a background on how I came to this. And so that's the real answer for why I'm not starting in the 1930s. And what I was initially trying to investigate, there's been a trend in human rights historiography to write about two booms. One in the late 1940s, sort of with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then one in '77. And I felt that there couldn't be nothing that had happened in between these moments. And so so that's another sort of explanation for my periodization. And then I really like the idea that the project is bookended by two inaugural addresses that talk about human rights. So that's part of why I began in the Kennedy years in 1961. So case selection. I considered Taiwan. I've collected materials on Taiwan, and I initially thought that my chapter that focuses on South Korea would be about East Asia. I was looking, or even Southeast Asia. I was collecting materials on Taiwan, on the Philippines, on Indonesia, on Vietnam, on a whole range of places, in part because I thought that South Korea was the most compelling story, but I wasn't sure I'd have enough documentation. And it turned out I have more than enough to focus just on South Korea. And what I want, as much as possible with these cases, is to choose countries where there are human rights violations that span several administrations, because I want to highlight the continuity that exists and that these issues aren't just a product of the Nixon years, but that Johnson, a president from a different party, faced many of these same pressures from members of Congress, from NGOs, etc. The Cyprus case that you mentioned, I'm deliberately stopping before Carter's inauguration because I want to emphasize the extent to which there was attention to human rights before his presidency. Essentially the way I chose my cases was to collect as much as I could, and it turns out that some of the cases that I expected that there would be materials about, I was really interested in trying to do Portugal or Spain, and there's almost nothing in the presidential libraries about U.S. attention to human rights violations there in these years. So in some ways I was driven not by what I might be most interested in, but by what members of Congress and U.S. citizens were most interested in at the time. So where there's huge volumes of correspondence, say to Donald Fraser, or where Goldberg is giving these speeches at the UN again and again, it was clear that those were the cases that I had to focus on. So I hope that answers your question.
Good. In the far back, Don.
Thank you for your talk. I'm Don Wolfensberger with the Wilson Center. I was wondering whether you might just talk a little bit more about Kennedy's inaugural address. I mean, it's been portrayed as a very hardline anti-communist, pro-freedom and so on, but there was a lot in there that would seem to stimulate human rights activists around the world and maybe give concern to dictators as well. Do you have any documentation as to how various elements around the world responded to the rhetoric of Kennedy's inaugural?
Unfortunately, I don't. It's on my list of things to work through at the Kennedy Library, but I have not finished all of my research yet. It's one of the benefits of doing a talk at this stage, is that there are many things that I'm still collecting information on, and I'm very interested in how the terminology made it in to the speech and what the intention was. Certainly, as with many things in Kennedy's inaugural address, I would say that the promise there was not lived up to. But I'm interested in the extent to which there was an intention to offer support, say, to nationalist movements elsewhere, people suffering repression, etc., or how much it was really framed in domestic political conceptions, which is, there's a new book out by Barbara Keyes, Reclaiming American Virtue, that I think is really going to change people's ideas about Carter's mention of human rights in his address. And she argues that it's an entirely domestic conception that he's talking about it. So I'd like to see, if it exists, back and forth between Kennedy and his speechwriters about this address.
Move up to the middle of the table.
Philip Brenner, American University. Sarah, thank you very much. This was really a wonderful talk. I feel very proud to be a colleague of yours. So I have two questions. First, a simple one, and then one more elaborate. You don't make any mention of any consideration of the Senate taking up the UN Protocol on Human Rights, even though several countries prior to this had signed it. The U.S. didn't sign it until 1992. Was there, and the concern, of course, was civil rights in the United States. Southerners didn't want to have it. Did you come across any concern in any of the White House papers you were looking at about signing U.S. signing that?
Do you want to give me your second question too?
Oh, okay. Second question is, I think that what you're doing here is very important, because I think both your immediate conclusion that the human rights movement started before Carter and had an impact, and that it focuses on many people who were involved, is terrific and right on. As someone who worked actually with Don Fraser and John Salzberg, who was very important for that, I can tell you that they really were genuinely concerned about this, and great people. I wonder if you're not raising a straw man, though, by suggesting that there's a consensus that 1977 is a breakthrough year. Because there are books that do point to, particularly those of us who focus on Latin America, know that there's work that was done on the way in which Congress pushed, particularly Senator Kennedy, Edward Kennedy, pushed the human rights legislation with respect to Argentina and Guatemala.
Chile.
And the Harkin Amendment comes out in 1975, is Laura Schultz's book on human rights in Latin America. And so I wonder if you're not raising a straw man. That's the second question.
Okay, great. So in terms of United Nations conventions on human rights, I alluded earlier to the Bricker Amendment controversy, and this was essentially an effort by Senator John Bricker to ensure that the United States would not be a party to UN international human rights treaties because of a concern that the United States Constitution could be undermined. And there were a number of reasons that there were concerns about this. One of them you mentioned is a concern about civil rights and what that might mean for things like Jim Crow in the South. And so the way, but this would have been an enormous threat to executive branch control over foreign policy. And so the Eisenhower administration essentially said that the United States would not submit UN conventions for Senate ratification. Kennedy shifted and sent up, I believe, initially 3 UN conventions for human rights. The Senate didn't act on them, but he did, sort of disavow Eisenhower's, the accommodation that Eisenhower had reached with Bricker and with senators who were concerned about this. And you see the tension, I think, about these conventions most clearly in 1968. I mentioned earlier was the United Nations International Year for Human Rights. And one of the items on the agenda for the year was for countries who had not ratified these conventions to do so. And there are a lot of internal discussions in the President's Commission for the International Year for Human Rights, which was led by Averell Harriman, about how the United States might be able to make this happen. Which senators could potentially be influenced? The American Bar Association was a great impediment. And, were there people there that perhaps they could reach out to? Could they try and influence popular opinion? And even though this was very much something that this presidential commission hoped would happen, they were unsuccessful. I mean, there was one or two smaller conventions. It's completely escaping me now what they were, but they were, I mean, you would think that all of these issues would be things that you could agree on. I think it was a convention on slavery. I mean, it was something that really the United States didn't want to not be supporting. But by and large, what happened is that every year the Senate just wouldn't take up these conventions. So I do see this issue coming up again and again because it's very difficult for the United States to criticize other countries' records if it itself has not signed on to these conventions. And US policymakers are aware of the problem that this presents. The larger question of the straw man, I mean, I completely agree with you that there's congressional activism about cutting off military and economic assistance to countries that are engaged in patterns of gross violations of human rights that predates the Carter administration. But I would say that wherever I go, wherever I talk about my research, wherever I mention that I work on human rights, people immediately ask me what I think about Sam Wine's book. It has been enormously influential. I would say it's been reviewed and commented upon outside of just academic journals, and it spurned a whole host of other articles. Now there's an edited volume by him and Jan Eckel, The Breakthrough, which is looking at human rights activism in a whole host of places, not just the United States. And so at least right now, I don't think it's a straw man. I think that there are many pieces of evidence that we could point to suggest that 1977 is not a breakthrough year in terms of congressional activism. And I've written on this elsewhere, but I don't yet think that we've moved beyond this sort of being the conventional wisdom. Whether it's sort of chart that he has in his book that shows this sort of massive explosion of mentions of the term human rights in the New York Times and the London Times, where he cites that in '77 the number of mentions of the term human rights was 5 times any previous year. I mean, part of it is about what type of sort of levels of permutations we're talking about. Is it congressional activism? Is it congressional legislation? Is it State Department or White House policy formulation? Is it popular perceptions? Is it how many people are protesting or writing letters about human rights? The Barbara Keyes book that I mentioned is about how Americans come to care and feel emotionally about human rights violations. So and I think she would argue, I think she would support this sort of mid to late 1970s argument as the sort of moment in which there's really a significant movement of people who are committed to this issue. So you can tell that I don't agree with the argument, but I don't yet think that there has been enough research to refute it, is what I would say.
How about right behind you there, and then we'll move back to this side of the table.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk, Professor Snyder. I'm Christopher Gray of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, where you were last week, and I'll be interested to hear what Ron and Jim Carthen, Waller McDougall, and Alan Luxembourg had to say to you there. 2 questions. One, have you looked at the Captive Nations group headed by Lev Dobryansky, Undersecretary of State Paula Dobryansky's father, for rallying human rights sentiment behind the Iron Curtain? And also the fact, I love the fact that you brought up the Bricker Amendment, because most of the McCarthyite senators were pro-civil rights domestically. This was a factor in Lyndon Johnson securing the censure of getting the Southern senators to unanimously censure him because they were frightened of him stirring up their Negroes. They were terrified of that fact. But what's also interesting is the Buckley brothers. Bill Buckley joins Amnesty International. He's one of the first conservatives to join Amnesty International. And his brother is elected in 1970, a fact which still shames a lot of New Yorkers. His brother becomes very active for campaigning for human rights behind the Iron Curtain, and it's the only thing he and Jacob Javits have in common. And that's one question, if you consider those. The other issue is there's an interesting tension. The Catholic Church, for instance, opposed Fulgencio Batista, and the U.S. Catholic Church had helped to bring him down. You have Protestant churches okaying the Soviet Union, like G. Bromley Oxnam, the great Methodist bishop, was a hero to both George McGovern and Walter Mondale's fathers, who were both Methodist ministers. You have Protestant church groups more concerned about Latin America, but Catholic church groups are concerned about human rights in Latin America, even in the 40s and 50s. If you look at Bishop Edwin O'Brien, have you looked at that? Because I think you're exactly right with this thesis. And I think 1974 with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the spring of 74 when Solzhenitsyn's kicked out of the Soviet Union, this is when I think human rights are brought to a boil. Helsinki follows the year afterwards. What do you think?
Great, thank you for all of those questions. So on the Captive Nations group and resolution, I talk about this a bit in the Kennedy section of my chapter on the Soviet Union, because I found some very interesting sort of back and forth between Kennedy and his advisors about if he was going to issue the resolution. And I think my memory is that in his first year of office, he issues the resolution several weeks before the sort of day that it's supposed to be. And then in the second year, he kind of goes back and forth about if he's really going to do it. And in the end, he sort of caves to political pressure and issues the resolution, I think, the day of or the day before sort of Captive Nations Day. And in the final year in which this is discussed, so I guess this must be the summer of '63, there's this great memo from one of his advisors that says, if you're going to do it, you might as well do it early. Because we came under so much pressure last year for you dragging your feet on issuing this resolution, and the Soviets get pissed no matter when you do it. So it was very interesting to see the kind of political calculations about this. And so it's clear that in the Kennedy years, when the administration is totally silent on human rights violations in the Soviet Union and the broader Soviet bloc, that this is one group that does have some influence in the administration. In terms of the sort of disparate political actors that you mentioned, I mean, human rights is amazing at unifying potential political opponents. It's something quite often that both sort of Cold War conservatives and liberals who disagree with the United States intervening abroad can agree on. It doesn't always happen, but there are some interesting coalitions that develop. And I would say the sort of letterhead where you see the board of directors of the U.S. branch of Amnesty International is one place where you can see these different alliances being formed. In terms of the role of religious organizations, beyond the groups that are concerned about Soviet Jewry, I actually haven't seen as much influence of religious groups as I had expected. A little bit with South Korea, given the significant missionary activity there, and that in the 1970s, missionaries and priests begin to be targets of the Park regime. And so I do see, there are people who have served as missionaries in South Korea who are testifying before Congress about these issues. But in the other cases that I've worked on, I actually haven't seen as much religious activism, but that may be because I've just started to write my chapter on Chile. And so I would expect that it's coming, but I've only gotten about 9 months out from the coup in my reading through of the documents. So I'm interested in it. I would expect to see it more, but it actually hasn't played as prominent of a role as I would have expected. And then I think with Solzhenitsyn's expulsion, you were just emphasizing, sort of agreeing with my larger point, that there was a lot of attention to human rights before '77. There wasn't an actual question there, was there?
There wasn't
A question about Solzhenitsyn?
Yes, well, a suggestion.
Suggestion, right.
Wait, okay.
Go ahead, finish it.
No, so it was a suggestion.
Yes.
Okay.
Question. Because that's when Kissinger was kind of embarrassed about it, but the right and the left came together, and you had people on the far left. You had Ted Kennedy and Jesse Holmes, both hailing Solzhenitsyn.
Mm-hmm.
And I think didn't he address Congress?
Yeah, there's a great article now some years ago in Diplomatic History about this, and how Ford's refusal to receive Solzhenitsyn at the White House created such a domestic political problem for him. And it's exactly the people that you're talking about. It's Jesse Helms and sort of the AFL-CIO who are working together to host Solzhenitsyn.
And on this side, I think we had a hand. Yes.
Professor Snyder. I really enjoy your talk. Thank you. I'm Shannon Nix from the University of Virginia. I'm a doctoral candidate there working on a dissertation on human rights activism in U.S. foreign policy in Central America. In later years, sort of Carter through Reagan. Building on Professor Brenner's question, I agree with you that there are two big foils out there, one with the Carter administration and then Moyne's book is, in and of itself is a foil. But I think in the second wave, I still see a lot of scholarship, as you point out, your own, Kenneth Camille, that's been around for a long time, pushing the envelope back to the 1973 and 1974 timeframe. My question to you, and I'm really glad that you're pushing the time frame back into the 60s, because I think that's absolutely right. With your treatment of Chile, I think there's kind of a second foil which says this is all about Pinochet in September 11th, 1973, when in fact there's quite a bit going on in Latin America before that. Are you, with Chile in and of itself, are you looking at pre-September 1973 activism and policy, Southern Cone, moving back a couple years to Brazil and so forth?
Okay, great. Thank you very much for these questions. I'm happy that you are glad that I'm moving backwards. I'm very happy that you're moving forwards. Whenever there are people working on the 1980s, it makes me very happy. It's a lot of work to get documents out of the Reagan Library. So I appreciate the work that you're doing. In terms of Chile, so far, well, so I would say, just like South Korea, where I initially imagined that as a regional chapter, I initially thought I would have a chapter in the Southern Cone. In part because I was a little worried about if I would have anything new to say about Chile. And so I collected on Uruguay, on Brazil, and Argentina. And what I've decided, at least for now, and this is again the benefit of it still being a work in progress, is that there's so much material on Chile that I think to try and do the entire region is just crazy. I mean, that would maybe be a whole book. I'm not even sure. It could be multiple books. My current reading of the existing historiography is that while there has been incredible interest in U.S. official actions leading up to the coup, and U.S. support, say, for U.S. involvement at different levels, there's actually been very little attention paid to criticism of U.S. policy from 1973 onwards. And so I do think that by looking at congressional efforts, but also sort of non-governmental efforts, that there might be something new to say there. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I'm only about 9 months post the coup in my research. And actually, what I've been experiencing is sort of incredible frustrations at the available documentary base, which makes me think that probably the story can't yet have been fully written because there's a lot of documents that I'm not seeing in there. A lot of phone calls to the Nixon Library trying to figure out exactly what's going on. So currently, I would say that my intention is to look just at Chile and just from the coup going forward, in part because that's where, when looking through members of Congress's personal papers, I've identified a spike in interest. And that's really what I'm basing my timelines on, is not sort of where we know there were real problems and maybe they were ignored, as much as once people start putting pressure on the executive branch to do more, or passing legislation to cut off military or economic assistance. But I'll keep your suggestion in mind and think about it as I work through this chapter. Thank you.
I'm going to slip in a question, if I may. You mentioned, I think in the question period early on, a question that you're working on, how Americans have come to be concerned about human rights violations. And in your talk, you used as an example Rhodesia and a coalition of African American organizations, including the NAACP and others, that lobbied, raised questions about what was taking place in American foreign policy. And so my question is this: before human rights abroad could become an issue of genuine principle as well as policy, didn't Americans first have to consider human rights at home, something that the civil rights activists from many years earlier, but certainly since the 1940s onward, were constantly raising and being constantly rebuffed on. So one could argue that in the 1950s and the early 1960s, the treatment of African Americans in the American South and elsewhere was nothing but a human rights abuse, and a major one at that. And then to point a finger abroad and to say, you are denying people the right to vote, you are segregating them, you are doing this and this and this and that, would be nothing short of absolutely hypocritical. So Americans themselves were not of one mind as to what constituted human rights abuses or whether that even mattered with regard to the South. Then the civil rights movement happens. These policies, which had been discredited in sort of northern and liberal circles, now become more broadly accepted with the 64 and 65 acts. So at least the domestic house is in the process of being put in order. Does that make any sense, or does that apply here, or is this sort of a completely separate and side story?
Well, I would say that you shouldn't underestimate how willing American policymakers are to be hypocritical in their criticisms.
I wouldn't do that. You're right.
But putting that aside, I completely agree with your sort of characterization of this. And one of the things that I argue in the book is that until the United States begins to feel more self-confident about the ways in which it's addressing its civil rights problems, it's much more hesitant to make criticisms of human rights violations abroad. What happens, I would say, particularly in the early Johnson years, is that the rhetoric starts to be, we acknowledge we have a problem. We are working on making it better, and you should too. And you hear that again and again. We are confronting our challenges. We are trying to eliminate racial discrimination. We are trying to have equal access to all of these different rights and opportunities. And we encourage you to do so as well. And so in some ways, it's a kind of disarming way of putting pressure on a country about human rights violations, because you're sort of in it together. And the United States used civil rights leaders for this purpose tactically. The International Year for Human Rights that I mentioned, 1968, culminated with a conference in Tehran, of all places. And Averell Harriman was the head of this presidential commission. He was supposed to head the delegation. And at a meeting not very long before this conference took place, there was some discussion led by the representative on the commission from the Equal Opportunity Commission saying, you know, maybe we shouldn't have an all-white delegation. What do you think that we try and inject a little diversity in here? And there was a lot of back and forth about the extent, surprisingly to me, a lot of back and forth about whether or not having diversity on the delegation was actually advisable. And I can't figure out what happened from the meeting until the delegation was named, just about one day later. But they asked, and he agreed, Roy Wilkins, the head of the NAACP, to head the delegation. He went to Tehran, this is right in the wake of the King assassination, and gave an amazing speech that, according to reports, led to a standing ovation, sort of rapturous applause, in which he directly confronted America's racial legacy, going all the way back into the period of slavery. And so they found that, and afterwards, the sort of telegrams back were, you know, this was a 10-strike, every sort of metaphor you could have, like the best perfect game that could be. And they were so pleased that the only criticism of U.S. foreign policy was about the war in Vietnam. And so Wilkins had served his purpose very well. And so the United States was very conscious of its record, how that affected its ability to make human rights criticisms of other countries, and used whenever possible people who could talk about the progress that the United States was making as the ones to be sort of putting the pressure on about human rights. And you see this in the UN too.
They had been doing that for any number of years prior to this point, but civil rights activists themselves were also keenly aware that they could use this as a point of vulnerability, and were constantly pointing out to U.S. policymakers just how bad the United States looked in its campaign against communism in the battle for the hearts and minds in Asia and in Africa as well. But that's very interesting. Yeah, Amanda.
Amanda Moniz, National History Center. Sarah, at the end of your talk, you said that citizen activism had an impact on policy making. Following up on it, I'm curious about that and the exchange you and Eric just had. I'd like to hear more about who the people are who are involved in activist groups, human rights activist groups. And following up on Eric's question, are they people with civil rights experience in the United States who take that pragmatic experience and turn it abroad? What are their backgrounds and what sparks their interests?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So what is distinct, I would say, for the period that I'm studying as opposed to what follows, is that by and large, people are not in human rights groups. They are, when they're in an organization, as opposed to just from their home sending in a letter to the White House or to a newspaper, they're by and large organized around a specific group. So in the wake of the coup in Greece, there develops in Washington the United States Committee for Democracy in Greece. And there are a whole host of different organizations that sprout up in support of Soviet Jewry. There are the Minnesotans for Freedom and Democracy in Greece. Very few of them are framing their concerns with human rights language. And I do think that that's important, particularly when we think about things like the chart in Sam Wine's book about this massive explosion of the use of term human rights in 1977. Certainly people are talking about issues that we would recognize as human rights, but I think they might not be using the same terminology, which I think is important for us to think about if we want to identify attention to human rights earlier. I talked about a number of sort of leaders of the most important civil rights organizations and their activism on Rhodesia. They're also very active in South Africa. They're also very active on wars for decolonization of Portuguese Africa. So they are not coming to human rights necessarily after their civil rights activism, but at the same time. And again, sort of talking about this letterhead of Amnesty International USA, there are leaders of key civil rights organizations who are on the board of directors of Amnesty International. So what's interesting to me is the extent to which people populate each other's organizations without necessarily say, well, first I was opposed, I advocated for civil rights, or I opposed the war in Vietnam, and then I did human rights. In this period, people are moving between these causes more fluidly than we might expect. But I think they also maybe aren't as much thinking of themselves as human rights activists as someone who's concerned with a particular issue. Donald Frazier is someone who appears in almost all of my chapters, but that's actually quite rare. There's an entirely different cast of characters who are concerned with human rights violations in the Soviet Union, whether they're regarding Soviet Jewry or otherwise, than the people who are concerned about what's happening in Rhodesia or in Greece. Occasionally there's someone like Goldberg who, because he's United States ambassador to the UN and he has to comment on so many of these issues in his capacity there, that I see him again and again, but there's actually not as much consistency as potentially you might imagine.
All right, return question.
Yes, this is just...
Microphone.
Pardon me on the microphone. You've read about Pat Darien, the Assistant Secretary of Human Rights. This will show that Amanda's actually dead on one case. Pat Darien, whose son was a close friend of my twin brother at Vanderbilt, was the leading white racial female liberal in the state of Mississippi, a big civil rights activist. She becomes the great activist for human rights in Latin America, and she eventually marries Harding Carter III, who, along with his father, are the leading male white racial liberals of Mississippi. And they're up to their necks in the civil rights movement domestically before they turn to foreign affairs.
Right, but she turns to foreign affairs after Carter's inauguration.
Yes, but she comes from that too.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
she comes from that background.
Absolutely, she comes from that background. But my understanding, at least, is that until she was appointed to be Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, that she had a domestic focus in her activism. So I think that if I was talking about the years 1977 onwards, we might see a bit of a difference, in part because some issues fall out of being as there's just a shift in what people are interested in as the United States pulls out of Vietnam, et cetera. So I'm not actually convinced that she refutes my statement. But she's a great case of someone who was very active in civil rights and then, clearly became the sort of leading voice on human rights in the Carter years.
I think Dane has a question for you.
Yeah, Dane Kennedy from the National History Center. First of all, a correction on my part and an apology. What I referred to in the introduction was your forthcoming book that you're writing right now. So
I was willing to take that.
No,
She's the author of. So.
I understand, but people should also know that you've written another book, and I'm going to mention it now since I failed to do so earlier. And this book is Human Rights Activism in the End of the Cold War, which was published just a year or two ago by Cambridge University Press. My question, there are some interesting issues that have already circulated here that intrigue me. One is the terminological issue. But another one is you have a sort of state-centered focus on human rights. And my general question is, can one, in fact, approach this subject, and did contemporaries approach it without seeing it as a conflict between individuals and the state?
Within the United States or overseas?
Overseas. Because today, for example, I mean, we talk about human rights as, for example, something that's a concern for women within, say, certain societies. There are any number of ways in which human rights is identified as an issue that doesn't necessarily correspond to the actions of states. At this particular point in time, was that part of the discourse or not?
Thank you very much for your clarification. And in part to answer that, I would refer to the definition that I gave earlier,
Okay.
that I'm not talking about human rights in their fullest sense as we might understand them. But I am talking about the rights which United States policymakers and activists seeking to influence the executive branch were talking about, which were almost exclusively political and civil liberties, which were being denied by a state.
Okay.
And so therefore the state's role overseas is essential, because in all of these cases, and Ian Smith's government in this period is very difficult to talk about because they're not necessarily a state if we don't recognize their Declaration of Independence from Great Britain, but the actors who are doing the repression, I think, go through all my cases in my head, it is all state repression.
Okay.
And the other reason that the state is key is that in all of the cases, the people are seeking to put pressure on the United States to act as a state by removing economic or military assistance, by supporting sanctions, by voting against these governments in the United Nations. They're not, I think that they would be happy if there was greater attention in the press, or if there was cultural products that condemned these governments. But what they really want is the United States to stop supporting military dictatorships, and for the United States government, and by extension its citizens, to stop being complicit in these violations. So for those reasons, I think it needs to be a state-focused approach. I would argue that that changes over time as human rights activism becomes much more transnational, and I think there are different ways in which they're able to advance their agendas, which is not just seeking to influence the United States government.
On that note, I am going to bring us reluctantly to a close, but first, two things. Conversations can continue on the other side of this door at the reception that we will be having. And secondly, I invite you all to come back next week for our final Washington History Seminar of this calendar year. And Susie Smith of Rutgers University will be speaking on everyday life in the North Korean Revolution. So thank you to our participants, and thank you to Sarah Snyder.